I'm Elizabeth Williamson. I'm the artistic director here at Geva Theatre Center and also the director and adapter of Jane Eyre. And I'm very lucky and honored to have tonight here with us Bette London, an eminent professor at the University of Rochester who's written extensively on 19th and 20th century British literature and indeed on Jane Eyre in particular. So we're really, really delighted to have her here to broaden our understanding of Charlotte Brontë and Jane Eyre. So join me in welcoming her. So I thought I'd start by asking you, somehow when I sat down to do this adaptation, it seemed very important to me to catch Jane's voice in the novel. That first person address of the novel seemed so key in getting a real sense of who she is and how she makes her life. And I wondered if you wanted to talk with us about Bronte's use of that and what the choice to have it be a first-person novel does for the novel.
All right. So when I read the play and then actually watching it tonight, that was something that immediately struck me and that I thought was just so interesting about your adaptation and really actually foregrounding this aspect of the voice. And in particular, something that I think in the reading experience you can almost lose sight of at times is that there really is this older Jane who is replaying the events of her life, but that the way that the story is narrated, and often it kind of has long sections that are told in a present tense as if they're happening at the moment. And so that you always have to play back between these two voices, the voices of Jane, the character as it were, and the voice of Jane as a narrator. And so that was one of the most exciting things to me in your adaptation, was the way that you foregrounded it from the very opening scene of Jane sitting there writing, and that this is this novel, in a sense, about how Jane becomes the author of her own story. So I guess that was the first thing I want to say about this.
That's great. Now, something I think it can be hard for us to remember reading the novel or watching an adaptation of it today is how revolutionary it was at the time. When I was first working on this, even I was kind of shocked, and I have a background in this period to a much lesser degree than you, and just to read some of the responses when it came out.
So certainly, and I think that in a way it's very interesting because I teach this course, I teach Jane Eyre. The course I'm actually teaching right now, and it's called Madness, Marriage, and Monstrosity. This is my course on the 19th century novel, but Jane Eyre is the perfect novel for this book because it has all of those things. But in the 19th century, Jane Eyre was a novel that women were often forbidden to read, or young girls were often forbidden to read, and it was seen as if it was a kind of dangerous text that would put the wrong ideas in their mind. And there is a very famous reviewer named Mrs. Rigby, and she writes, and I think this was actually in the notes in the program, in the dramaturgy notes, but she says that Jane is the personification of an unregenerate and undisciplined spirit. And this is the sort of voice of everything sort of revolutionary in the society. She also says more or less as, I never want this woman as a governess for my child, you know, and that her thoughts were too dangerous. But I think that, and I think that we can certainly see that in particular in these speeches, and I think another really interesting thing about your adaptation was the way that you played with the time frame. And chose not to sort of tell the story in strictly chronological order, but to begin with Jane's departure from Lowood and her going to Thornfield, and then introducing the sort of childhood memories later. And I thought that actually worked. Quite well. But it also highlighted the way in which the scene when the young Jane speaks out to Mrs. Reed and says, "You think I have no feelings?" In some ways, it's precisely the speech that she will give in the next scene when she meets up with Rochester and he toys with her before actually proposing. And those are sort of incredible speeches, in themselves. Although for me, they always have this feel of these speeches that you reverse in your own head. And you can imagine, if I can only say all of these things with this kind of eloquence, but that are hard to say in other contexts. So that's one part. And in the book, when Jane speaks out like that, afterwards she's kind of deflated, and she says a child can't actually speak that way to an elder. Not just because the society won't allow it, but her own sort of doubts afterward. And there's this real tension between these moments of her having this articulateness, this assertiveness of her own independence, and then almost kind of collapsing into a more docile and submissive mode. There's a line late in the book when she says, I have no medium between absolute submission and outright revolt. And so even though I think the revolt is really interesting, I think that the novel is really about that tension between revolt and submission. Now you chose to begin with part of what I think today when people teach this book, especially people who are teaching it from a feminist perspective, Jane's speech about women wanting more from their lives, women wanting not just to be passive, wanting a space for the exercise of their intelligence and their abilities. So I think you've sort of located the origins of your story of this play in precisely what, especially beginning really around the 70s and the 80s, started to turn Jane Eyre into a cult text for feminism. But in my own work on it, I've really been interested in the ways in which it is both revolutionary and not revolutionary at the same time. And I kind of like the sort of coyness of ending on what's really a very famous line in this novel, Reader, I married him. But there are a lot of different ways to interpret it. And one is the sort of triumphant, this is finally what she wants. And the other is almost apologetic. Reader, I married him. And I think what's very interesting for me teaching this book is how my students' responses have sort of changed over the years. And also many of them, and I think many of us, this is a book we've read over and over again. And when you read it when you're young, it means one thing, but reading it later sometimes it means something else. And so many people read it and are completely invested in this romance. Actually interesting. Even like, so there were the negative reviews, right, that we talked about, it was too revolutionary. But then there were other reviews that were just about what an amazing narrative it was and how gripping. And one of the reviews by a male reviewer talks about how he was so absorbed by the story and just kind of breathlessly followed the whole thing. And then he said, and at 2 o'clock in the morning, I married Mr. Rochester. So I think the capacity of that book to have that effect. But I think that today's students sometimes are a little bit more like, could we imagine a different ending for Jane? Is marrying Mr. Rochester the only end we can imagine? One critic, and I can't remember now who it is, says, could we imagine an end where Jane and Bertha go off together? But I guess that what I was saying is, in my own work, and I think the book, I want to say, I think it's just open to all these different interpretations, and also you can interpret it almost a different way each time you read it. So I think that's one of the things that that I like. So in my reading, I was really trying to question a little bit just how revolutionary Jane really was, or how much she really fit this model of a proto-feminist, and was really looking at sort of ways in which there are all kinds of things that seem very problematic about her relationship with Rochester. But I thought in your adaptation, that you really were doing a really great job, I think, of updating the play in some way, but also finding a way to kind of actually stress those sides that really are about Jane's autonomy, about the independence of her voice. I haven't ever seen a Jane with quite the voice that you've given her, which is really more assertive, more knowing, almost sort of winking at the audience, as she speaks. But the Rochester in this also is somebody who is, some of his more imperious and manipulative aspects are toned down in your...
That's something I really wanted to ask you about, because it's something we've all been grappling with. I'm lucky enough that Helen Sadler created the role in Hartford, and the actor who created the role of Rochester in the first production wasn't available for the second production. We were very lucky to get Rob, who I think is extremely brilliant, and I feel very, very lucky that he came and did it. But it's been fascinating to recreate that relationship and to find we went, and this is really a moment where one talks about the power of the actor's interpretation on stage, because with the exact same adaptation, plus or minus a word here or there, we had the first time off a much more self-centered Rochester, and the second time a Rochester who I think Rob found every moment in the language in which Rochester is checking in about consent or excited about a changing power dynamic. The moment when we were working the proposal and he said, you know, I want to pick her up and put her on the bench. And you immediately have the appeal of the shift in power dynamic there was really fascinating to watch and fascinating to me, because I tend to go, well, if I've got great actors, I don't want to try to push someone into someone else's interpretation. So I ended up with these two, both really meaty, rich interpretations with very strong actors, but having very different reads in a way on the relationship. So I was super curious to hear your thoughts on the relationship.
So I think that's really fascinating, but I think it also speaks to what I was trying to say about how much this text can really lend itself to these different interpretations, and then even your words. I was very struck in your adaptation of how closely you hewed to the words of the text, and so much so that when I was reading it, and I taught this book a million times, I've read it too many times, I have a copy of the book where all the pages are falling out, but occasionally I would come to this passage and I'd say, is that in the text? Because especially when you teach something a lot of times and you tend to have certain scenes and passages that are really important to you, then you kind of forget some of the other ones that you weren't looking at. And then I'd say, oh yeah, that's actually that's actually there. But then, at the same time, obviously things have to be compressed, right? To do this. But there are also things that are left out, right, in the presentation. So what I'm starting to say is when I would teach this at first, and I'd have all these students who were really totally invested in the romance between Jane and Rochester, and that's what they're sort of reading for, but also in Jane's spunkiness and independence on all of that. So I would try to push them to sort of actually think about some of these things that are problematic in the power relationship between Rochester and Jane. And at first they were very resistant to that reading. The last time I taught this, I was having to defend Rochester to my students because they wanted to talk about toxic masculinity. That's how they read it. And certainly in the actor's interpretation, there's just a lot more playfulness. So that the scenes when Jane comes back to Thornfield after she meets Rochester, and he doesn't reveal his identity. Rochester is always withholding things from Jane, which is just one of the many ways that he exercises power on her. But I think that the sort of scenes where he is, he's grilling her and he's sort of saying, sit here, answer my questions, do this, and then he says to her, he's asking about her qualifications, and He says something like, you know, do you play the piano? And she says, oh, a little. And he says, oh, you know, that's what all, you know, young girls are taught to say. Go into that room and play. And she plays like 5 notes. He says, you're right, you play a little, you know.
And I'm not, oh dear, do I have to have the piano upstage in that bit, or can I cut those?
But I was going to say that in some ways, at least, you know, one can read this as just much more authoritarian and much more his exercising this role of master over her, which then makes this sort of romance have to sort of work, you know, against that. But so that the choice, let's say, to very early on have Rochester respond to Jane's pictures really becomes one of those moments where you see Rochester actually appreciating something in Jane that other people might not see. But at least as I read it in the book, it's a little bit more touchy in the sense of just this demand, these pictures that are her inner self, that she's put her whole self in, and he just sort of, you know, thinks, command, I can look at that, you know, I can have access to your innermost thoughts. So I thought that that power element seemed less here and more the side of Rochester that really does identify this profound way with Jane.
Totally, but can we also just say, for those who don't know, for 19th century governess, the portfolio of your watercolors would be part of your stock in trade. Can you do watercolors? Can you teach French and Italian? Can you do a little music? So it's that interesting thing where we, I think the first time around, went immediately to the he's grabbing her paintings, and I was like, on the other hand, that is part of the job interview, which to a degree the scene is his belatedly doing the job interview.
I think that's interesting, and I mean certainly, you know, this kind of notion. I always joke with my students that in the 19th century, women were supposed to have all of these accomplishments. They could sing, they could paint, they could, you know, watercolors or whatever. I thought I would never make it in the 19th century. I don't have any accomplishments, but I felt
that's what Liza Bennett says, of course.
Right? Yes, exactly. But I do think so. I think that is true. But I have this for me in my reading. I think that there are the sort of standard sort of pictures she has, but that this particular set of pictures that she does on her vacation, I see as somehow being ones that are more private than
it's done through the portfolio and immediately gone, that's how I get to her.
I love it.
You've mentioned Bertha a couple times, and I feel like we would have an inadequate conversation about the story if we didn't talk a little bit about that, and I'm so curious to hear what you think, because I'll just say when I was in college reading those major essays on Jane Eyre from the 70s and 80s, they definitely had a profound impact on me, this idea that Bertha is to some degree the danger of what might happen to Jane, and it just sort of that's what we immediately understand about the context of marriage, etc. But I didn't deliberately put anything in the adaptation. I tried to just hew to what Brontë has. So I'm so curious to hear you talk about that.
So I think that in some way that was going to be one of the other things that I was going to think of, because it seems now almost inevitable that when one teaches Jane Eyre, Bertha's become this major subject, and in many ways there are sort of two works that I think have been really most influential in this. And one of them, I don't know if people here are familiar with Jean Rhys's 1966 novel, White Sargasso Sea. And Jean Rhys, who is a writer from the Caribbean, but she writes this novel, which in a sense is the prequel to Jane Eyre. And she wants to write the novel from the point of view of the madwoman, of the first Mrs. Rochester. And in her, so her story was so powerful. And what she says is she was always fascinated by this figure, but fascinated by the fact that this figure has no voice at all, right? So we talk about how powerful Jane's voice is, but the first Mrs. Rochester has only a laugh and inarticulate sounds. But in Jean Rhys's story, which really also has to do with the history of the Caribbean post-emancipation, Bertha is the daughter of natives of Jamaica, but of European descent. Her father is a slaveholder, and so all of these sort of dynamics, are at play there. But very much, at least she puts out as a proposition that, in spite of the fact that we can tell this narrative about her coming from a mad mother and other madness in the family, Rhys suggests this madness may really be, in many ways, socially produced. But she also suggests very profoundly that one way we might read this story is Rochester driving his first wife mad. So rather than being saddled with a mad woman, her madness is in many ways a result of Rochester coming, making love to her, but not really loving her, and rejecting her, not understanding her culture, and then forcibly transplanting her into this alien culture. So there was Rhys's novel, and then in 1979, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar published a book called The Mad Woman in the Attic. And Jane Eyre is, in a way, the classic book behind this. And in effect, they say, why is it that all these 19th century novels by women have mad women stashed away somewhere? And the argument they offer is not just that Bertha is the sort of danger or warning, although she certainly is that, but she's also in some way Jane's dark double, the mirror image of Jane. So that in the scene when Bertha comes to Jane's room, and I think in your production it's the night before the wedding, in the novel.
I shortened the time
but you know what I'm
frame,
saying? And it makes absolute sense because it reads as if it's the night before the wedding, even if it isn't. I mean, that's the way it sort of feels. But when Jane actually sees her, it's when she catches her reflection in the mirror. And so this question of Bertha in some way as a mirror image for Jane, a mirror as sameness and mirror as opposite.
And that is, in fact, I mean, in this sort of world of not wanting to force an interpretation, because there have been adaptations that have sort of taken that and let it drive the adaptation, and I thought, well, I want to make sure everything that Brontë has is in there, and that's why the being frightened of herself in the mirror is there, and that's the same mirror as the mirror in the room, and the same language returning, but I didn't want to sort of push it, so I'm always curious if any of that is actually how it reads, since I was not like,
So I mean, definitely felt like the production really, again, I thought that some of the way that the shifts in those times actually were able to underline those similarities. And so Jane in the Red Room, seeing the sort of ghostly figure. But interestingly, a part of this that you left out, and again, I would never for a minute say, fault you. I mean, this is a very long novel, make choices. But if one follows the kind of argument, well, part of the argument of Bertha as a kind of mirror image and dark double is that Bertha is also acting out Jane's own hidden desires or acting out Jane's own rage. So if we have a reading in which we're calling more attention to the things that are overbearing and manipulative about Rochester's behavior, then one can understand more how the anger that she sort of expresses might correspond to Jane's anger as well. But this part that is not really discussed much in your presentation, just very briefly in a kind of voiceover of Jane, is after Rochester proposes and accepts the sort of period of courtship. And the period of courtship in the novel really seems to sort of emphasize that as soon as Jane accepts him, we see Rochester, in a sense, trying to make Jane over. And that there is, including sort of, repeatedly, and you do sort of have like this part where he calls her Janet, right, or whatever, which is both affectionate but also this changing of the name. He's calling her my little elf, my daffodil, and Jane is like, that's not me, right, But he's also showering her with jewels and, wants her to have all these beautiful clothes, but the jewels she describes as being like chains, as being imprisoned. And there's this real sense that she's very worried about losing herself in this marriage. And so she sort of describes this passage that also sort of involves a mirror, where she sort of says, she describes like the wedding approaching, and it's like this countdown. It's like she's a prisoner in her cell, and it couldn't be put off any longer. The day is coming, but all of her wedding apparel is laid out. It's laid out, and the trunks are there, and it's laid out in the room, and they have these tags attached to them that Mr. Rochester has written himself, and they say Mrs. Rochester. And Jane sort of looks at this and says, I don't know who this Mrs. Rochester is. That's not me. And there's really this sense that she is really also feeling this anxiety about the marriage, which is not simply this kind of intuition that there's another Mrs. Rochester there, but that there's something wrong with this marriage, at least as their relationship exists at this moment. And I don't know if it's in that or on the wedding morning, but when she sees her own image in the mirror, she doesn't recognize herself, and it's ghostly. So it's like one more of those mirror images.
Yeah, which we have the little bit right before Bertha comes in, which is
The other thing I wanted to say that I think is interesting, and again, they're hard choices, that as people have chosen to focus on different things, so at first it was really, offering this narrative that in some ways would offer more sympathy for the first Mrs. Rochester, or an understanding of how we might think about her. But increasingly now, readings have also been sort of concerned about the way that first Mrs. Rochester is demonized, and others. And in the text itself, when Jane describes her first sort of encounter with it, of just telling Rochester, and they're talking about this figure as an it, and this sort of language, and then later in the scene after the wedding, when he reveals his wife, Jane describes her as a clothed hyena. And there's a tremendous amount of animalistic imagery. She's described as sort of having purple skin and distended lips and red eyes. And so they're really, and then people have really also read this as racialized imagery connected to her Caribbean upbringing. And even though she's a sort of white Caribbean, in this kind of hierarchy, she also takes on these characteristics. So I think there's been some kind of uneasiness about the ways in which Jane, even as she's fighting for her own autonomy and independence, is complicit in certain ways with certain kinds of class and racial attitudes, and doesn't really, at least again, sticking to the words of the novel, recognize this connection to the first Mrs. Rochester.
not at all. I mean, I've always reading the novel felt Brontë didn't.
I think that's true.
Yeah, no, that's a key piece. I got a 2-minute signal from Rachel. We should probably wrap it up. But any last thoughts for us?
That's
We covered the big points.
Two birds in my face.
Well, thank you so much. This has been such a valuable, enlightening conversation. It's really wonderful.